Hello, I'm Peter. I'm so glad you could join me for tonight's journey. There are moments in history when the world grew so cold that survival itself became an act of quiet genius. Not the kind written about in books or celebrated in monuments, but the kind whispered between generations around dying fires. Picture a landscape stripped of mercy. The wind comes howling across 1,000 miles of open grassland with nothing to slow it, carrying cold that doesn't just chill the air, but seems to steal the very possibility of warmth from the world. Temperatures that would kill an unprepared person in hours. Snow that buries landmarks and erases the familiar. And in the middle of all this, families not just surviving, but living full lives, raising children who grew strong, telling stories that made the darkness shorter, maintaining a culture that would endure long after the winter passed. How did they do it? That's what we're here to discover together. Not through the lens of modern survival shows or wilderness challenges, but through the patient, practiced wisdom of people who understood that winter wasn't an enemy to be fought, but a season to be lived through, with intelligence, preparation, and an understanding of the natural world so deep it bordered on conversation. They didn't conquer the cold. They learned to arrange their lives so carefully that the cold simply had fewer ways to reach them. Forget lucky hacks. Tonight, we decode a lost science. By orchestrating shelter geometry, fire rhythms, and body heat, these people engineered a survival machine. They practiced intuitive thermodynamics, understanding physics without equations, to build a system so efficient it would baffle a modern engineer. And here's what makes this story different from so many others. This isn't about desperation. This isn't about people barely clinging to life. The families we're learning about tonight thrived. They raised children in these conditions. They maintained joy ceremony and cultural richness, even when the world outside their shelters could kill in minutes. They found ways to make the long, dark months not just bearable, but meaningful. So, settle in. Get comfortable. Let the warmth of your own space remind you of how far we've come, but also of how much wisdom we've left behind. The wind is picking up outside our imagined camp. The sun is setting behind clouds heavy with snow. But inside, there's warmth waiting. There's knowledge that has kept people alive for longer than we can easily imagine. And there's a story that deserves to be told slowly, carefully, the way all good stories about survival should be told, because the details matter. The small choices matter. The quiet wisdom matters. Let's begin. Before we talk about shelters or fires or any of the things that kept people alive through the frozen months, we need to understand something that might seem obvious but is actually profound in its implications. The Plains tribes didn't just happen to survive winter. They didn't stumble into safety. Every single family that made it through to spring did so because someone somewhere in their lineage had learned to read the land like a book written in wind and stone, and the way snow drifted against hillsides. Summer camps and winter camps were different universes. In the warm months, you wanted height, you wanted breeze, you wanted visibility across the grasslands to see the great herds of buffalo moving like dark rivers across golden prairie. You wanted to be up where the air moved and the view stretched forever. But when the first serious cold arrived, when the geese formed their long arrows pointing south, and the aspens turned their leaves to coins of gold, the mathematics of survival changed completely. The elders would gather. They would talk in that particular way that people talk when lives depend on the decision being made. And they would begin the calculation that would determine whether their families saw another spring. They were looking for something specific, something that modern meteorologists would recognize immediately as microclimate selection, but which to them was simply the difference between a winter of relative comfort and a winter where you wake each morning uncertain if you'll make it to nightfall. Imagine you're standing on the high plains in late autumn. The grass is the color of honey and dying sunlight. The wind, even now before the deep cold has arrived, moves across this ocean of land with nothing to slow it. You can feel how exposed everything is, how open, how vulnerable. And you realize with the clarity that comes from generations of accumulated loss that you cannot stay here. The wind will steal your heat. The snow will bury you. The cold will find every gap, every weakness, every moment of inattention. So you begin to move. Not randomly, but with purpose, born from stories told on previous winter nights. Stories of families who chose poorly and paid prices too high to think about directly. You're looking for the places where the land itself offers protection. You're moving toward the rivers. This migration wasn't a panicked flight. It was a measured withdrawal to prepared ground, like a chess player moving pieces into position long before the critical moment of the game. The rivers that cut through the plains, rivers like the Missouri, the Yellowstone, the Platte. These weren't just sources of water. They were corridors of survival carved by time into the landscape valleys, where the land rose up on either side to create natural fortification against the endless horizontal wind. When you descend from the exposed heights into these river valleys, something changes immediately. The wind that was constant, that was everywhere, suddenly has direction, suddenly has an enemy. The bluffs, the rising walls of earth and stone that border these waterways, they break the wind's power. They force it up and over, creating pockets of relatively still air in their lee. And in winter, still air is survivable air. Still air can be warmed. Still air doesn't steal heat from bodies and shelters at the rate that moving air does. But here's where the knowledge becomes precise, where observation sharpened over lifetimes began to matter in ways that determined who lived and who didn't. Because not every part of the river valley was equal. Not every spot offered the same protection. There was a specific science, unwritten, but absolutely real, to choosing exactly where to place your family's lodge. The elders understood something that seems almost counterintuitive at first. The very bottom of a valley, the lowest point where you might think you'd find the most protection, could be a death trap. They knew this not from textbooks, but from finding frozen families who had made this mistake, or from their own near misses in youth, or from stories so old no one remembered the original teller, but everyone remembered the lesson. Cold air is heavy, heavier than warm air. This is simple physics, but when you're living inside that physics rather than studying it, the knowledge takes a different form. It becomes visceral. It becomes the memory of waking in a valley bottom camp and feeling cold so profound it seems to press down from above, heavy as water, thick as something you could almost touch. On still nights, when the sky clears and the stars come out sharp enough to cut the cold air drains downhill like invisible water, flowing along the ground, seeking the lowest point, pooling in valley bottoms, and creating what we might call today frost pockets or cold air sinks. The temperature difference between the valley floor and a location just 50 or 100 feet higher could be 10, 15, even 20 degrees. In conditions where every degree matters, where the difference between 20 below zero and 30 below zero is the difference between difficult and potentially fatal, this knowledge was everything. So they would climb. Not all the way back to the exposed heights they'd left, but part way. They would find the terraces, the natural benches carved by ancient floods, or geological patience places where the valley widened slightly and flattened before continuing down to the river itself. These terraces sat in what's called the thermal belt, the sweet spot where you were protected from the wind above, but elevated enough to avoid the deadly pooling of cold air below. And then there was the question of sunlight, which in winter becomes precious in ways that summer dwellers can barely imagine. The lodges, these conical structures we'll talk about in detail soon, were almost universally oriented with their doorways facing east. This wasn't religious observance alone, though it might have had spiritual dimensions. It was practical wisdom, so fundamental it needed no explanation. Eastern orientation meant greeting the morning sun directly. As soon as the first light touched the horizon, it would stream through the doorway, bringing whatever meager warmth it could offer, beginning the slow work of thawing the ice that had formed overnight on every surface, the frost that grew in fantastic patterns on the inner walls, the frozen condensation from breath and cooking that turned shelters into caves of crystal each night. But there was more. The prevailing winds on the plains blew from the west and northwest, carrying Arctic cold down from the true north, where winter ruled absolutely. By facing east, by turning their backs to these dominant winds, the lodges presented their strongest, most solid face to the onslaught. The door, the one major opening, faced away from the wind sheltered, protected, creating a pressure differential that actually helped draw smoke up and out, while keeping the brutal gusts from blasting directly into living spaces. The people who made these choices weren't thinking in terms of meteorology or thermal dynamics. They were thinking in terms of whether their children would wake up crying from cold, whether the fire would stay lit through the night, whether they would burn through their carefully gathered fuel stores too quickly and face weeks of deep winter with nothing left to burn. But the results were the same, as if they had drawn diagrams and made calculations. They had found through attention and experience the optimal solutions. And there were more subtle factors still. The presence of rock formations mattered. Stone especially, dark stone absorbs heat during any sunny day, even a winter day when the sun seems to offer more light than warmth. Then, through the night, that stone radiates its stored heat back out, slowly creating a slightly warmer microclimate nearby. Camps positioned near south-facing cliffs or large boulder fields would be noticeably warmer than camps just a few hundred yards away that lacked these natural heat batteries. Water sources had to be considered, but carefully. Too close to the river, and you risked being trapped by flooding if a warm spell hit and ice broke up suddenly. Too far, and gathering water a daily necessity, even in winter became a dangerous exposure to cold. The ideal distance was close enough to reach with a quick walk, far enough to be safe from the water's dangers, and crucially from its tendency to generate its own cold microclimate. Rivers, even frozen rivers, create zones of colder air around them, like they're exhaling winter. Wood was survival. Not just for fire, but for repairs, for tools, for the constant small maintenance that keeping a lodge functional through months of harsh weather demanded. So proximity to stands of cottonwood or willow mattered intensely. But these trees grew along the rivers, which meant balancing the need for fuel against the dangers of flooding and cold air drainage. The best camps found locations where a short walk could access good timber, but the camp itself sat above and away from the densest riparian growth. And finally, though they might never have articulated it exactly this way, they were choosing spots that provided what we might call psychological shelter, as well as physical protection. Places where the land felt like it was holding them, rather than exposing them. Where the specific configuration of hillside and water and stone created a sense of enclosure without claustrophobia, of safety without imprisonment. Because they would be here for months, and the mental weight of unending winter, of being trapped by weather too fierce to travel through, could be as dangerous as the cold itself. This was the first layer of survival. Before shelter, before fire, before any of the ingenious specific techniques that kept bodies warm and spirits hopeful, came the choice of where to be. And in that choice, made communally debated, perhaps drawing on both current observation and centuries of inherited understanding, the families of the Plains tribes gave themselves the single most important advantage in their struggle to survive until spring. They chose ground where the wind lost its power, where the cold couldn't pool, where the sun would find them earliest each day, where resources lay within reach, but dangers remained at bay. They chose, in essence, to let the land itself do much of the work of protection, to position themselves not against nature, but within its patterns, finding the spots where those patterns bent in directions favorable to human life. This is something we've largely forgotten, we who live in houses that work the same, regardless of their orientation in cities where microclimate matters little, because we've encased ourselves in artificial environments. But there was a time, not even that long ago in the span of human history, when knowing how to read a landscape in winter, when understanding the mathematics of cold air and sun angles and wind patterns was the foundation on which all other survival knowledge was built. And on those carefully chosen terraces, in those deliberately positioned spaces, where the land offered its protection and its resources, the next chapter of winter survival would unfold. The people would build their shelters, those remarkable conical structures that have become iconic of Plains culture. But the genius of those shelters only became fully effective because of the genius of their placement. The land was chosen. The site was prepared. And now, with winter closing in, with the wind beginning to carry the smell of distant snow, the real work of creating a winter home would begin. If you've seen a tipi before, even just in photographs or old paintings, you might think you understand it. A cone of poles covered in hides, or canvas smoke drifting from the top, something primitive and simple from a time before we knew how to build proper houses. But you would be wrong in ways that are difficult to overstate. The winter tipi was one of the most sophisticated pieces of human shelter ever developed, a structure that used physics and fluid dynamics and thermodynamics in ways that wouldn't be formally understood by science for centuries after the people who built them had perfected their design. Let me tell you what they knew, these people we so often underestimate. They knew that wind is not a single force, but a flow, something that can be guided and shaped like water, something that will follow certain paths when presented with certain obstacles. And they understood that winter wind on the plains was not a nuisance to be blocked, but a fundamental force that had to be accommodated, worked with, turned from enemy into something that could be managed. The shape of the tipi, that familiar cone rising from grassland or riverbank, is not arbitrary. It's not the easiest shape to build, not the most efficient use of materials, not the quickest to erect. But it is, for the specific challenges of surviving plains winter, nearly perfect. Watch what happens when wind hits a conical structure. Unlike a flat wall which presents a surface for wind to push against building pressure until either the wind finds a way around or the structure fails, the cone deflects. The wind strikes the sloped surface and immediately divides, flowing up and around, following the curve of the structure rather than fighting it. This is the same principle that allows aircraft wings to generate lift and water to flow smoothly around stones in a stream. The tipi doesn't resist the wind so much as redirect it, becoming nearly invisible to the force that would otherwise tear a flat-walled shelter apart or bury it in drifting snow. Tests done in modern times have shown that a properly constructed tipi can withstand winds that would flatten contemporary camping tents. We're talking sustained winds of 50, 60, even 70 miles per hour. Blizzard force winds, winds that make standing upright outdoors difficult. And the tipi stands the wind screaming around it, but unable to find purchase, unable to generate the kind of pressure differential that rips structures apart. But the genius goes deeper than simple wind deflection. The winter tipi was deliberately asymmetrical. The back, the side facing the prevailing winds, was steeper than the front. This wasn't a mistake or a quirk of construction. It was calculated design. That steeper rear slope did several things simultaneously. First, it presented an even more effective deflection surface to the strongest winds. Second, it created more interior space in the area where the sleeping platforms would be located away from the door. Third, and perhaps most subtly, it changed the internal air dynamics in ways that made the structure work better as a complete system with its fire and ventilation. The poles that formed the framework of the tipi were carefully selected. Not just any tree would do. They needed to be straight, yes, but also strong, resilient, able to bend slightly without breaking when wind loaded them. Different tribes used different trees based on what their territories provided. Lodgepole pine in some regions, cedar in others, each chosen for properties that experience had proven reliable. These poles, often 15 or 20 of them, were bound together at the top, creating a structure that distributed stress across multiple load-bearing elements, rather than concentrating it in a few key points. If one pole weakened, the others compensated. The whole system had redundancy built in, not because someone understood engineering principles in the modern sense, but because experience had taught the hard way that structures which depended on single points of strength failed when you needed them most. Now we come to the covering, and here the sophistication becomes almost overwhelming when you really think about what was being accomplished. The buffalo hide was the material of choice, though later, after the massive buffalo herds were destroyed, canvas became more common. But buffalo hide properly prepared was extraordinary stuff. Each large tipa might use 10 to 15 hides, sewn together by women whose skill at this work was recognized as being as critical to survival as any hunter's ability. These hides weren't just fastened over the poles like a tarp thrown over a frame. They were carefully tailored, each hide positioned and sewn so that the natural curves and thicknesses created, in essence, a three-dimensional fabric perfectly matched to the conical frame. The seams were placed thoughtfully, often with overlaps that shed water and snow downward, never allowing horizontal seams where moisture could collect and seep through. And here's something that's easy to miss, but crucial: buffalo hide, unlike modern synthetic fabrics, breathes. Microscopic pores in the leather allow air and moisture vapor to pass through slowly. This is vital. In a completely sealed shelter in winter, the humidity from cooking, from breathing, from the very presence of living bodies will condense on cold surfaces and create constant dampness. Ice will form. Everything will become gradually soaked. The breathability of hide meant that moisture could escape gradually at a rate that prevented condensation while not allowing so much air exchange that heat was lost too rapidly. But we haven't yet talked about the most immediately visible feature of the tipi: those two triangular flaps extending from the top like ears on either side of the smoke opening. These smoke flaps were controlled by poles from the ground poles that extended up to the flaps and allowed someone standing outside to adjust their angle and orientation. And this adjustment was constant, a daily, sometimes hourly task, depending on wind conditions. Because these flaps did something remarkable. They turned the top of the tipi into a variable chimney system that could be tuned to the wind direction at any moment. When positioned correctly, the smoke flaps created a low-pressure zone at the smoke hole. Wind flowing over and around the flaps would generate a suction effect, actively pulling smoke up and out of the interior. This is the Venturi effect, the same principle used in modern chimneys and exhaust systems. But these people discovered and perfected it through observation and adjustment, making their living structures into functional machines for managing fire and smoke. On a still day, the flaps might be opened wide, allowing smoke to drift upward through simple convection. When wind came from the west, the flaps would be adjusted one way. From the north, adjusted another. In heavy snow, they might be partially closed, preventing precipitation from falling directly into the fire pit, but still maintaining enough opening to allow smoke escape. The person managing these flaps was performing a sophisticated meteorological dance, reading wind and weather and adjusting their shelter in real time to maintain optimal conditions inside. And there was subtlety in the size of the smoke hole itself. Too large and heat escaped too quickly. Too small and smoke accumulated, making the interior unlivable. The size chosen, refined over generations, was the minimum necessary to allow smoke escape while retaining maximum heat. In the coldest weather, some smoke in the upper reaches of the tipi was acceptable, even normal. It hung in a layer well above the heads of seated occupants, and people learned to live beneath it in the clearer air below, accepting this compromise between warmth and perfect air quality. The door was another element that showed deep thought. It wasn't a swinging door like we use now. It was a hide covering, usually oval or elongated, that could be rolled or tied aside in good weather, but sealed tightly when storms hit. This flexibility mattered. Unlike a rigid door with gaps and hinges, the hide covering could be made virtually airtight when needed. blocking wind and snow completely. But it could also be partially opened for ventilation, or fully opened to welcome morning sun and fresh air on milder days. Around the base of the tipi, during winter camps, the covering would be pegged down tightly, and often stones or packed snow would be piled around the perimeter, creating a seal against ground-level drafts. This is where cold air most wanted to enter, flowing like water under the walls. By creating this seal by essentially making the tipi sit atop a slight berm of insulating material, the structure became far more weatherproof. Some of you might be thinking, this all sounds complicated, and it was. But understand that for the people living this life, these weren't complex engineering principles to be studied. They were simply the right way to set up winter camp knowledge, taught from parent to child, demonstrated and practiced until the correct angles, the proper tensions, the feel of everything being just right became intuitive. A group of experienced adults could erect a complete tipi in an hour or less, working together with the smooth coordination that comes from having done something many times. And when it was complete, when the poles were set and lashed, when the covering was pulled tight and pegged down, when the smoke flaps were adjusted, and the door covering secured what stood there in the wind, was not a primitive tent, but a precisely engineered structure that had been evolved over centuries to do one thing: perfectly create a manageable space where fire could be maintained, smoke could be vented, and human life could persist through weather that would kill in hours without shelter. The tipi breathed with the wind instead of fighting it. It shed snow by its shape. It allowed smoke to escape while retaining heat. It could be adjusted, tuned, optimized for changing conditions. And it could be disassembled and moved when necessary, packed on poles and carried to the next carefully chosen site, then erected again with the same practiced efficiency. This was architecture without architects, engineering without engineers. This was human ingenuity responding to environmental pressure with solutions so elegant that we're still impressed when we understand them fully. The conical breadth of the tipi, the way it seemed almost alive, responsive to wind and weather, protecting the life within while flowing with the forces outside, this was genius of a specific and profound kind. And we haven't even gotten to the most ingenious part yet. Because the tipi itself, magnificent as it was, became truly effective only when combined with a second element, an inner structure that turned good shelter into genuinely sophisticated climate control. But that comes next. For now, imagine the wind testing that cone, flowing around it, searching for weakness and finding none, while inside a family prepares for the long night ahead. There's a moment that comes in every winter shelter, a moment familiar to anyone who has tried to stay warm in a tent or cabin through cold nights. The fire dies down, heat escapes upward and outward, and you feel the cold begin to win. It creeps in through every gap, settles on every surface, turns breath to frost, and makes sleeping a battle against constant shivering. And you realize that the shelter, for all its walls and covering, is just a slight improvement over being directly exposed to winter, unless you know the secret. The people living in tipis through Plains winters knew something that transformed their shelter from adequate to genuinely effective. They understood that the real enemy wasn't just cold air outside, but the way heat moved, the way it flowed away from sources of warmth and escaped through any available path. And they developed a solution so elegant, so thermodynamically sophisticated, that when modern engineers analyze it, they find principles that wouldn't be formally described in physics textbooks for another century or more. The secret was the liner. And if you just glossed over that word thinking, you understood it, thinking it was just some inner curtain for decoration or modest privacy, then let me take you deeper into what this element actually accomplished. Imagine you're sitting inside the tipi on a day when the temperature outside is below zero, when the wind is making the hide covering snap and rustle, despite being pulled tight when frost forms instantly on any surface exposed to the air. Now, imagine a second wall, a wall that lives inside the outer wall, separated from it by a gap of perhaps 6 inches to a foot. This inner wall rises from the ground to about head height for a seated person, creating, in essence, a smaller room within the larger room. This was the liner, sometimes called a dew cloth, for reasons that will become clear, and it changed everything. The physics involved are what we call today creating a dead airspace. Air, when trapped and prevented from moving, is actually an excellent insulator. This is why down jackets work, why double-paned windows outperform single panes, why fur keeps animals warm. It's not the material itself providing insulation, so much as the still air trapped within or around the material. The liner created a pocket of trapped air between itself and the outer hide covering. Cold air from outside, even if it penetrated the outer wall, would have to cross this insulating gap before reaching the living space. And heat from inside trying to escape outward would be slowed by the same barrier. The temperature gradient across this gap was significant. The outer hide might be at 10 degrees above zero, while the liner facing the interior stayed at 40 or 50 degrees, a difference that made comfort possible. But the liner did more than just create static insulation. It managed airflow in ways that seem almost impossibly clever. Cold air is heavy, denser than warm air. This is why cold settles in valleys, why your feet are coldest in an unheated room, why frost forms on the ground first. In a single wall shelter, this cold air would sink and pool at ground level, right where people sat and slept, creating a lake of cold that no fire could entirely defeat. But with the liner in place, something different happened. The liner didn't go all the way to the ground. There was a gap, a deliberate space at the bottom. Cold air seeking the lowest point, as always, would flow under the outer wall and into this gap between liner and covering. But instead of flooding into the living space, it was channeled upward in the space between the walls. As it rose, it was gradually warmed by contact with the liner, which was being heated from the inside by the fire and the presence of warm bodies. By the time this air reached the top of the tipi, it had been significantly warmed and would mix with the smoke and hot air rising from the fire, all of it exiting through the smoke hole. This created a convection loop, a constant, gentle circulation of air that provided fresh oxygen for the fire and for breathing, while never creating the kind of cold draft that makes warming impossible. The air that touched the inhabitants was air that had been pre-warmed by passing between the walls. It was ventilation without the penalty of direct exposure to outside temperatures. And then there was the issue of moisture, which might seem like a small thing until you've tried to live through weeks of winter in a shelter where everything is constantly damp. Humans breathe out moisture. We exhale water vapor with every breath. Cooking creates steam. Even our skin releases moisture constantly through insensible perspiration. In a cold shelter with impermeable walls, all this moisture has nowhere to go. It condenses on the coldest surfaces, which are usually the walls and ceiling. This condensation then freezes, creating thick layers of ice that eventually melt enough to drip, soaking everything. Sleeping robes become damp and lose their insulating ability. Clothes stay wet. The environment inside becomes both cold and humid, the worst possible combination. The liner, coupled with the breathable nature of hide, solved this problem with elegant simplicity. Moisture vapor from inside the living space would pass through the liner into the gap between walls. There, because the temperature was above freezing, but below the dew point, some of it might condense on the inside of the outer covering. But because this was separated from the living space, it didn't drip on the inhabitants. And over time, this moisture would either be vented out with the rising warm air, or would pass through the breathable hide to the outside air, where it would disperse or freeze harmlessly on the exterior surface. The name dew cloth came from this function. It was the cloth that caught and managed the dew, the condensation keeping it away from the people who needed to stay dry to stay warm. Now imagine taking this concept one step further. In the coldest weather, when even the insulation of the liner wasn't quite enough, some families would add another element called an ozan. This was a piece of hide or cloth suspended horizontally inside the tipi, creating a sort of half ceiling over the sleeping and living area. The ozan captured and held the warmest air in the tipi, the air that wanted to rise straight to the smoke hole and escape into the winter night. It created a pocket of trapped heat right where people needed it most. It also reflected radiant heat from the fire back downward into the living space, instead of allowing it to radiate upward and be lost. And as a bonus, it caught any stray sparks or ash that might fall from the smoke hole area, protecting the bedding and inhabitants below. With the ozan in place, the tipi became a structure with 3 distinct thermal zones. At the very top above, the ozan was the smokiest, hottest, most turbulent air on its way out of the shelter. Below the ozan, but above the height where people sat, was a zone of clean but cooler air. And at the bottom, in the space where people actually lived and slept, was the warmest, most stable air held there by the combined effects of the liner, the ozan, and the careful management of the fire. Women were typically responsible for constructing and maintaining the liner, and ozan and their skill at this work was recognized as being absolutely critical to survival. They would often decorate these inner elements with paintings or designs, turning functional objects into art. But never in a way that compromised function. The liner had to be positioned exactly right, stretched taut enough to maintain the air gap, but not so tight it couldn't be adjusted. The fastenings had to be secure, but also accessible for the constant small modifications that changing weather demanded. And here's what might be the most impressive detail of all: the entire system was adjustable in real time. If the weather was moderate, the liner might be rolled up partially to allow more air circulation. If a severe storm hit, it would be lowered and secured completely. If the fire burned hot, the ozan might be raised slightly to let some heat escape. If fuel was scarce and the fire smaller, it might be lowered to trap every possible bit of warmth. The inhabitants weren't just living inside shelter. They were actively managing a thermal environment, making constant small decisions based on wind direction, fire size, number of people present, outdoor temperature, and a dozen other factors. The tipa wasn't a static structure, but a responsive one, almost alive in its ability to be modified and optimized. When anthropologists first seriously studied these shelters, when they started to really understand what was happening thermally and aerodynamically, they were stunned. Here was technology developed by people without formal scientific training, without testing equipment or mathematical models, that nevertheless incorporated principles of thermodynamics, fluid dynamics, and thermal mass management that rival or exceed many modern systems. The double-wall design has since been copied in countless modern applications. High-performance tents use a similar principle. Double-paned windows are fundamentally the same concept. Even the walls of modern energy-efficient homes often incorporate air gaps and vapor barriers that serve the same functions as the tipi's liner and breathable hide covering. But the people who developed this system didn't think of it as inventing anything. They weren't trying to be clever or innovative in the way we think of those terms. They were simply trying to keep their children warm to make it through another winter, to maintain the kind of comfort that allowed life to be more than just suffering endurance. And in that trying, in that patient observation of what worked and what didn't, they created something that has never been substantially improved upon for its specific purpose. In the depth of winter, when storms raged outside and snow piled high against the outer walls, a family could sit comfortably inside their tipi, the air warm enough to be comfortable in light clothing dry, despite the humidity from cooking, and breathing free from drafts despite the wind battering the structure. The fire could burn reasonably small, conserving precious fuel because the shelter itself was doing so much of the work of maintaining warmth. This was the double wall secret. This was the knowledge that turned good shelter into excellent shelter, that transformed survival from a constant struggle into something that could be maintained with less stress, less fuel, less danger. The liner and the ozan, working with the conical design and careful positioning, created a system that managed heat and moisture and airflow with a sophistication that we're still impressed by when we stop to really understand it. And now that the shelter was this effective, now that the basic problem of creating a manageable interior space had been solved so thoroughly, the next question became, what happens inside? How do you generate warmth efficiently? How do you maintain fire safely in this space? How do you turn the theoretical protection of good shelter into the actual lived experience of comfort in impossible conditions? That's where we go next, into the heart of the system, to the fire itself, and the knowledge required to make it servant rather than master. Fire is older than our species. Before humans were fully human, before language as we know it, there was fire. And yet, for all its antiquity, for all the countless generations that have depended on it, truly understanding fire is knowledge that has to be learned, practiced, refined. A poor fire in extreme cold is almost worse than no fire at all, wasting fuel without generating adequate heat-filling shelter, with smoke creating a false sense of security, while slowly burning through resources that should have lasted the winter. The people living through plains winters understood fire in a way that's hard for most of us to grasp now. They didn't just know how to make fire. They knew fire. They knew its moods, its requirements, its possibilities. They could read smoke like we read text. They could judge heat by sound and smell. And they had developed techniques for managing fire inside their shelters that allowed warmth and light while minimizing danger and maximizing efficiency. Let's begin with the most basic question. The one that seems obvious until you really think about it. Where does the fire go? The fire pit in a winter tipi wasn't a random spot where someone decided to start burning wood. Its location was calculated with precision. Dead center of the floor space, directly beneath the smoke hole far above. This alignment was crucial. Smoke and hot air rise straight upward when not disturbed by drafts. By placing the fire directly under the only opening, by creating a vertical column of rising heat with an unobstructed path to the outside, the tipi became in essence a chimney, with the fire at the base and living space around it. But the pit itself, that depression in the earth where the fire would live, that required knowledge too. Too shallow, and the fire spread too much used fuel, inefficiently created more radiant heat than was needed, and made the space immediately around it uncomfortably hot, while leaving the edges cold. Too deep, and the fire would be starved of oxygen, would smolder, and smoke excessively would be difficult to tend. Experience had determined that a depth of about 6 to 8 inches was optimal for most conditions. Deep enough to contain the fire, to create a slight focusing of heat upward, but shallow enough to allow good airflow and easy maintenance. The pit would be lined with stones if suitable rocks were available. Not just any stones, mind you, because some rocks contain water or air pockets that can explode violently when heated. River rocks were particularly dangerous. But flat rocks from dry areas, stones that could be tested beforehand by heating, slowly, these could be arranged to line the pit, creating a structure that did several things simultaneously. The stones absorbed heat during the evening when the fire burned hottest. Then, through the long night, even as the fire died down to conserve fuel, the stones slowly released their stored warmth, acting as thermal batteries that smoothed out the temperature swings and kept the chill at bay during the coldest pre-dawn hours. The stones also created a more defined burn area, containing coals and ash, making fire management cleaner and more predictable. Now the wood itself. This is where knowledge became survival in its most direct form. Not all wood burns the same. This seems obvious, but the specifics matter intensely when you're trying to extract maximum heat from minimum fuel through months. When gathering more wood might be impossible due to storms or snow depth. Different woods burned at different rates, produced different amounts of heat, created different qualities of coals, and even produced smoke with different characteristics. Cedar and other softwoods burned hot and fast. They were excellent for getting a fire started quickly, for creating immediate warmth when coming in from brutal cold. But they consumed themselves rapidly, meaning you needed more volume of wood for the same heating duration. The smoke from cedar was clean-smelling and had properties that some believed helped preserve stored meat and discourage insects. In the morning, when the lodge was cold and needed rapid heating, cedar might be chosen. Hardwoods, like oak or ash when available, burned slower and hotter, producing thick beds of coals that could be maintained through the night with periodic additions of fuel. These coals were precious. A good bed of coals meant that reviving the fire in the morning was simple, just a matter of adding tinder and small wood, rather than the entire process of fire starting from scratch. The wood had to be absolutely dry. Wet or even damp wood was worse than useless. It consumed heat to evaporate its water content, producing steam and smoke instead of warmth. Storing wood inside the shelter for a day before burning it, allowing it to dry in the relative warmth of the interior, was standard practice. Fuel was often stacked near the door in the coldest part of the tipi, so its drying didn't waste precious heat. And then there was buffalo chips, those dried patties of dung from the great herds that had once covered the plains like a living carpet. When wood was scarce or unavailable, chips became the primary fuel source, and people who hadn't used them would be surprised at how well they worked. Dried chips burned with a steady, moderate heat. They didn't flame dramatically, but smouldered reliably, producing a bed of hot ash that radiated warmth for hours. The smoke, while distinctive in smell, wasn't unpleasant once you grew accustomed to it, and it had the virtue of being relatively clean, not leaving heavy deposits of creosote or soot. Gathering chips before winter, stockpiling them near camp, or even inside the shelter was as important as gathering wood, and in some areas more so. The arrangement of fuel in the fire pit mattered as much as the fuel itself. A loose, haphazard pile of wood would burn through quickly, creating brief heat and long periods of cold. But wood stacked deliberately, creating pathways for air to feed the fire while maintaining structure as it burned, would produce steady, reliable warmth. The classic arrangement was conical or teepee-shaped smaller sticks, leaning against each other to create a structure that burned from the bottom up and inside out, continuously collapsing inward as it consumed itself, maintaining a compact, hot core. As pieces burned through, new wood would be added, not by throwing it onto the fire, but by placing it deliberately, maintaining the structure, keeping air channels open. Through the night, someone would tend the fire. This wasn't a job assigned randomly, but usually fell to young adults, those old enough to understand the responsibility, but young enough that losing some sleep didn't carry the same burden as it would for elders or nursing mothers. They would wake, periodically judge the fire's state, add fuel as needed. Too much, and fuel was wasted. Too little, and the fire might die, or the lodge would grow too cold, waking others in discomfort. Reading a fire in darkness was an art. You couldn't see as well as in daylight, but you could hear. A good fire had a steady, soft crackle. A fire that was being starved of oxygen would hiss and pop irregularly. A fire burning too hot, wasting fuel, would roar slightly, a sound you could feel as much as hear. The fire tender learned to know these sounds, to respond to them automatically, half asleep, but still competent. The coals that accumulated at the base of the fire pit were like gold. They were heat in its most concentrated, enduring form. A proper bed of coals tended correctly could be maintained for days or even weeks, never completely going cold. Each morning, these coals would be the foundation for the new fire, saving the effort and resources of starting from scratch. In extreme, cold, wasting coals was considered a serious mistake, a failure of duty that endangered everyone. And here's something beautiful in its simplicity. The fire wasn't just for heat. It was light in the long darkness. It was a place to gather a focus for the family. It was comfort, psychological as much as physical. Humans have been sitting around fires for so long that we have instincts built around it, feelings of safety and community that fire triggers without conscious thought. In the depth of winter, when the world outside was hostile and dark, that fire was the literal and figurative center of life. But fire is also danger. Always. A spark on dry bedding could turn shelter into death trap in minutes. Children had to be taught fire discipline. Adults had to remain constantly aware. The smoke hole had to stay open even in the worst weather. because the alternative was suffocation by smoke, or worse, by the odorless killer that we call carbon monoxide. The fire had to be positioned precisely. The wood, added carefully, the space around it, kept clear of anything that might catch and burn. There were stories passed quietly of lodges that had burned, of families lost. These stories weren't told to frighten, but to teach, to ensure that the knowledge of fire safety was refreshed in every generation. Fire was servant helper, the difference between life and death. But it demanded respect and attention every single moment of its existence. In the coldest depths of winter, when storms raged for days without break, when going outside even briefly was dangerous, the fire became the absolute center of existence. It heated stones for warming beds. It melted snow for water. It cooked what food there was. It dried wet clothing. It provided light for the small tasks that maintained life and sanity. And perhaps most important of all, it was proof that humans could create warmth in a world trying to freeze them, could maintain a tiny sphere of comfort in the vast, cold darkness outside. The heart of embers, the glowing core of the fire pit, was the heart of survival. And surrounding it, supporting it, depending on it, was the intricate web of other knowledge and technique that made winter life possible. Which brings us to the ground itself, to what lay between the cold earth and the warm bodies trying to sleep, because solving the problem of the bed was every bit as crucial as solving the problem of fire. You might think, having established shelter and fire, that warmth would be assured. But anyone who has tried to sleep on cold ground knows that the earth is a thief. It pulls heat from your body with relentless patience, sucking warmth through clothing, through blankets, through anything that separates you from its cold mass. You can be wearing the finest insulation wrapped in the best materials and still wake shivering because you've been lying on frozen ground that has stolen your warmth through simple, unstoppable conduction. The people of the plains understood this enemy intimately. They knew that fire could warm the air, could drive chill from a space, but fire alone couldn't solve the problem of sleeping through long winter nights when the ground beneath them was frozen solid to depths of feet or more. They needed something between themselves and that cold earth, something that would insulate, that would hold warmth close to their bodies, instead of letting it bleed away into the infinite cold sink below. Their solution was the willow bed, though calling it simply a bed understates what it really was. It was an engineered sleeping platform created entirely from natural materials that performed with an efficiency that modern camping pads can barely match. Let's build one together in your imagination, so you understand not just what it was, but why it worked. You begin with willow branches, or sometimes other flexible woods depending on what's available. These branches are cut to length, perhaps 3 to 4 feet long, and gathered in quantities that would seem excessive until you understand what you're building. You're going to create not a flat surface, but a woven platform, a mat of interlaced branches that will have specific properties crucial to your survival. The branches are laid parallel, first perhaps 20 or 30 of them side by side. Then more branches are woven crosswise through them, over and under, creating a basket weave pattern. The result is a slightly flexible platform that sits several inches above the ground. And those several inches are everything. The willow mat creates airspace beneath the sleeping area. Air, remember, is an insulator when it's trapped and prevented from moving. That cushion of air between the platform and the frozen ground interrupts the conductive heat loss that would otherwise flow directly from body to earth. But the willow does more than just create a gap. The woven branches themselves, with their internal structure of wood cells and tiny air pockets, add another layer of insulation. And the flexibility of the platform means that it adjusts to the body's weight, creating a surface more comfortable than the hard earth while maintaining its insulating properties. But the willow mat is only the foundation. The real magic comes in the layers above it. Next comes grass. Not just any grass and not fresh grass, but dried grass that had been cut, and stored grass that had cured until it was crisp and full of dead air spaces. This grass would be piled onto the willow platform in amounts that would seem absurd, layers that might be a foot thick or more. And this grass, properly fluffed and arranged, became insulation that rivaled anything modern materials can achieve. Think about the structure of dried grass. Each blade is hollow or semi-hollow, filled with air. When you pile thousands of grass blades together, creating a mat that compresses only slightly under your weight, you're creating an intricate three-dimensional matrix of tiny air pockets. This is the same principle that makes fiberglass insulation work, that makes down feathers incredibly warm. Trapped air, millions of tiny pockets of it, each one interrupting the flow of heat. And dried grass had another property that mattered intensely. Through the long winter, it smelled like summer, like sunshine and growth and warmth. This might seem like a small thing, but when you've been trapped in winter for months, when everything outside is ice and death, that smell of cut grass can lift spirits in ways that are hard to overstate. Its psychological warmth to go with the physical warmth, a reminder that summer did exist and will exist again. The grass had to be maintained. It would gradually compact under the weight of bodies, night after night, losing some of its loft and therefore its insulating ability. So every few days, someone would pull the sleeping robes back, remove the grass, fluff it thoroughly to restore air between the blades, and replace it. Sometimes grass would be rotated out entirely, replaced with fresh, dried grass from stores kept for that purpose. On top of the grass came hides. First, often a layer of elk or deer hide laid hair side down against the grass to create a smooth surface and add one more insulating layer. Then came the sleeping robes, the most precious items a family owned, the difference between difficult sleep and impossible sleep. Buffalo robes were the gold standard. A buffalo hide taken in winter when the animal's coat was thickest, tanned with the hair left on, created a covering that could keep a sleeping person warm in temperatures that would kill them if they were exposed. The hide itself was thick and nearly windproof. The fur, that thick winter undercoat and longer guard hairs, trapped air right against the body, creating what was essentially a portable microclimate. These robes were used fur side in directly against the body or against inner clothing. The warmth of the skin would warm the air trapped in the fur, and that air would stay warm, held by the structure of the hair. A person wrapped in a buffalo robe, lying on properly prepared bedding, could sleep comfortably through nights. When the air inside the tipi dropped well below freezing, when their breath frosted on the walls, when frost formed on anything not near the fire. But one robe might not be enough in the coldest weather. People would layer them, creating sleeping nests, where multiple robes fur to fur created such effective insulation that the sleeper's body heat would make the innermost layer almost hot. Couples would share a sleeping space, pooling their body heat. Parents would sleep with young children between them, creating a human furnace of combined metabolic warmth. The arrangement of these sleeping areas within the tipi was thoughtful. The warmest spots closest to the fire were reserved for the most vulnerable, the very young, the very old, the sick. Young, healthy adults who could better tolerate cold might sleep farther from the fire, giving up the prime spots to those who needed warmth more desperately. And position mattered in another way. People slept in a circle around the fire heads toward the center feet toward the walls. This meant that the head where heat loss is significant due to blood flow to the brain was in the warmest area. The feet, while farther from the fire, were protected by the multiple insulating layers and by being tucked deep into the sleeping robes. On the coldest nights, people would go to sleep almost fully dressed, wearing layers of hide clothing, sometimes even keeping their outer robes loosely draped. The idea wasn't to get warm by the fire and then sleep, but to maintain the warmth your body was already generating by trapping it as effectively as possible. You were creating a series of nested environments, your body warming the air inside your clothing, that clothing nestled in your sleeping robe, that robe on insulating bedding, that bedding inside an insulated shelter. Each layer reduced heat loss. Each boundary maintained a temperature gradient that favored warmth accumulation rather than heat escape. There were other refinements, other small technologies that added to comfort. Pillows made from hides stuffed with grass or moss. Small partitions of hide that could be hung to divide sleeping areas, creating even smaller, more easily heated spaces. Spare robes used as covers over sleeping robes, adding yet another layer of insulation on the coldest nights. And there was a kind of intimacy to this sleeping arrangement that we've lost in our modern separated bedrooms. Families slept in close proximity, hearing each other breathe, feeling the collective warmth. There was comfort in this, especially for children. The dark and cold outside were absolute. But here in the ring of sleeping bodies around the glowing coals of the banked fire, there was warmth and safety and the presence of those you loved. If someone needed to rise in the night to add fuel to the fire or to answer nature's call, they would do so carefully, trying not to disturb others, moving quietly in practiced ways that minimized heat loss. The door covering would be lifted just enough to slip through, then immediately closed behind them. Any exposure to the outside cold was minimized, kept to bare necessity. Morning brought its own challenges. Waking to cold air emerging from the warmth of sleeping robes into the chill of morning before the fire had been built up was perhaps the hardest moment of each day. The person whose responsibility it was to tend the morning fire, to coax the banked coals back to life and add fuel until warmth began to spread again, that person earned their place of honor in the family. The willow bed, the grass, the carefully arranged hides and robes, all of this together created sleeping conditions that made survival not just possible, but bearable. People woke rested rather than exhausted from shivering. They maintained their health rather than succumbing to the slow debilitation that chronic cold exposure causes. They could face each new day with energy rather than the desperate fatigue of fighting the cold all night. This layer of knowledge, this understanding of ground insulation and bedding and sleeping arrangement was as sophisticated as the shelter design itself. It addressed a specific problem that fire alone couldn't solve, that good walls alone couldn't prevent. And it solved that problem using only materials that the land provided, materials that could be gathered and prepared with tools of wood and stone and bone. When you picture these winter camps now, don't imagine people suffering miserably, barely surviving. Imagine them sleeping soundly warm in their carefully constructed nests, the fire glowing softly, the wind harmless outside the double walls of their shelter. This was comfort earned through knowledge and preparation, and skill comfort achieved in conditions that should have made it impossible. And this comfort wasn't individual. It was shared communal, built on the understanding that survival meant protecting everyone, that warmth was something you created together. Which brings us to perhaps the most profound element of winter survival, how people themselves became part of the heating system, how bodies arranged carefully could generate and maintain warmth in ways that multiplied the effectiveness of everything else they'd built. There's a number that matters more than any other in extreme cold survival: 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the temperature your body must maintain at its core to function, to live. A few degrees below that, and your thinking slows, your movements become clumsy, your judgment fails. Drop further and you lose consciousness. Further still, and your heart stops. In winter, cold that might be 60, 80, even 100 degrees below that critical number, your body becomes a furnace that must burn continuously just to maintain that tiny margin between life and death. And here's the remarkable thing: your body generates heat simply by existing. Metabolic processes. The chemical reactions that keep you alive produce thermal energy as a byproduct. When you're sitting quietly resting, you're producing heat at a rate of about 100 watts. That's like a bright incandescent light bulb worth of energy radiating from you constantly. In a normal environment, you shed this heat without thinking about it. But in extreme cold, that heat becomes precious. Learning to retain it, to share it, to multiply its effectiveness became knowledge that determined who survived winter and who didn't. The people of the plains understood something profound about survival. You don't survive winter alone. Not in a spiritual or emotional sense, though that's true too, but in a literal thermodynamic sense. A single person generates heat that dissipates quickly into the vast cold. But people together, arranged carefully, could create pools of warmth greater than the sum of their individual contributions. Let's talk about the geometry of survival. In the coldest nights, sleeping arrangements became strategic. Families didn't just happen to lie near each other. They positioned themselves deliberately, creating what we might call today a thermal mass strategy. Adults who generated the most body heat due to their larger size and muscle mass would position themselves on the outside of sleeping groups, creating a windbreak and thermal barrier. Children and elders who either generated less heat or were more vulnerable to losing it would sleep in the middle, surrounded by this buffer of higher heat-producing bodies. This wasn't charity or mere kindness, though it was those things too. It was mathematical necessity. A child sleeping alone, even with good bedding and robes, might struggle to maintain core temperature through a long winter night. But that same child sleeping between two adults was receiving thermal radiation. From both sides, was protected from any drafts. By larger bodies, was nestled in a microclimate that their own small furnace could help maintain rather than trying to heat alone. couples would sleep together, of course, but the positioning mattered. They would often sleep back to back or front to back, maximizing surface contact. This wasn't about romantic comfort, but about survival. Where bodies touched, heat transfer was most efficient. The warmth one body generated wasn't lost to the air, but was transferred directly to the other body, which would do the same in return. Two people sleeping in contact could stay warmer with less metabolic effort than two people sleeping separately. Elders, those whose circulation had slowed, whose bodies no longer generated heat, as effectively would be given the warmest positions, but also would be provided with additional insulation. Extra hides might cover them. Their sleeping spots might be closest to where heated stones had been placed, in the bedding receiving radiant warmth from the earth itself all night long. The young and healthy could tolerate more cold. The old could not. So the resources and the warmth were allocated to protect those most vulnerable. And then there were the dogs. The relationship between plains people and their dogs was complex and vital, and nowhere more so than in winter survival. Dogs that had proven their value, that were working animals critical to the community, would often sleep inside the tipi, adding their metabolic heat to the collective warmth. A large dog generates about as much heat as a small human. 3 dogs, the number referenced in the old phrase, 3-dog night, could add significant warmth to a shelter. But dogs did more than just generate heat. They were early warning systems for danger alert, even when humans slept deeply. They were companions that reduced the psychological weight of isolation. And they were in absolute extremis food, though that was a line crossed only in the most desperate circumstances, and only with animals not considered part of the working pack. The clothing people wore to bed was part of this heat retention system too. You didn't undress for sleep in a winter teepee. Instead, you might adjust, removing outer layers that could be used as extra covering, but keeping inner layers that trapped air next to your skin. Soft deerskin or other supple leather-worn fur-in created a perfect base layer that wickered moisture away from skin while trapping warm air against the body. And moisture management mattered intensely more than you might think. Sweat was enemy. If your clothing became wet from perspiration, whether from too much activity or too many layers, that moisture would pull heat from your body through evaporative cooling. This could be deadly, so people learned to regulate their clothing, not for maximum warmth, but for optimal warmth, for the point where they stayed warm without sweating. This sometimes meant wearing less than you'd expect, trusting the sheltering layers of teepee and bedding and shared warmth rather than piling on too much personal insulation. Breathing was managed too. In the coldest conditions, people would burrow deep into their sleeping robes, creating a small airspace around their face that would be warmed by their breath. But they learned not to breathe directly onto fur or hide for extended periods, because their exhaled moisture would freeze in the material, creating ice that would then melt against skin, causing dangerous moisture accumulation. Instead, they might create a small breathing hole in the robes or position themselves so breath could escape without freezing directly on their bedding. Children learned these skills early. They learned to stay still in their sleeping places because movement let warm air escape and cold air enter. They learned to sleep curled, reducing surface area and creating the most efficient shape for heat retention. They learned to tuck hands under arms to keep feet pulled up to make their bodies into compact spheres that generated and retained warmth most effectively. But beyond the physical techniques was something harder to quantify, but just as real: the psychological warmth of community. Knowing you weren't alone, feeling the presence of family breathing nearby, hearing the soft sounds of others sleeping peacefully, this reduced stress. And stress, anxiety, fear, all of these trigger physiological responses that waste energy and make staying warm harder. Calm, secure people stay warm more easily than anxious, isolated people. In the depth of winter, when storms raged for days and going outside was impossible, the tipi became the entire world. And in that small world measured in feet rather than miles, the family became an organism in itself, a collective entity that maintained homeostasis through cooperation and shared resources. Heat wasn't hoarded, but circulated. Warmth wasn't individual, but communal. Survival wasn't a personal achievement, but a group project. There were protocols for protecting the vulnerable that went beyond simple positioning. If someone was sick, if they had reduced ability to generate heat due to illness or injury, special measures would be taken. They might be given heated stones wrapped in hide objects that would radiate warmth through the night. Their bedding might be enhanced with extra insulation. Others might volunteer to sleep particularly close to them, providing direct body heat transfer. New mothers with infants faced particular challenges. Babies with their high surface area to volume ratio lose heat rapidly. But babies couldn't be heavily covered because of the suffocation risk. The solution was contact. The infant would sleep against the mother's body, often inside her clothing, directly against her skin. This skin-to-skin contact provided warmth, but also allowed the mother to monitor the baby's breathing to respond instantly to any distress. The mother would position herself closest to the fire, giving up other comfort to ensure the infant's survival. In the very coldest snaps, when the temperature inside the tipi, despite fire and insulation, still dropped to dangerous levels, the entire family might sleep under a shared cover of multiple robes, creating a kind of group cocoon. This wasn't comfortable in the modern sense. Space was tight, movement restricted. But the combined heat of multiple bodies in close proximity could maintain survivable conditions when individual sleeping areas might become dangerously cold. Movement during the night was coordinated to minimize heat loss. If someone needed to tend the fire, they would do so quickly, keeping exposure to the colder air brief. Others might adjust their sleeping robes to seal gaps that had opened when the person rose. When the person returned to their sleeping spot, they would curl back into the warm depression they'd left, rather than spreading out into cold areas of the bedding. Morning was the most dangerous time. Bodies that had been still all night conserving energy, generating just enough heat to maintain core temperature, would be sluggish and cold. Rising too quickly could lead to dizziness, to a dangerous drop in blood pressure. So people woke slowly, moving gradually, allowing circulation to increase in stages. The fire would be built up, first warming the air, before people emerged from their sleeping robes. This human heat shield, this understanding that bodies together were stronger than bodies alone, that warmth shared was, warmth multiplied, represented a level of social cooperation that went beyond culture into biology. The family unit wasn't just emotionally close, but thermally integrated. You kept your children warm, not from the outside by providing insulation, but from the inside, by being part of their environment yourself. Modern military and adventure training often rediscovers these principles when teaching cold weather survival. The buddy system isn't just about mutual assistance, but about thermal cooperation. Huddling together isn't a sign of weakness, but an intelligent response to cold stress. But the Plains people had refined this understanding over centuries, until it was simply how life was lived. Knowledge so fundamental it needed no explanation. And yet, even with all of this, even with perfect shelter and managed fire and optimal sleeping arrangements, the cold was not fully defeated. There remained one more element of survival, one more technology that addressed the absolute extremes, the conditions where everything else wasn't quite enough. That's where we turn next to the sometimes harsh, sometimes ingenious final barriers between skin and freeze. We come now to the most intimate level of protection, to the very boundary between body and environment, to knowledge that might seem crude at first, but which represented some of the most sophisticated understanding of human physiology and cold weather stress. This is the science of skin protection, of creating barriers that would preserve tissue when every other defense had been deployed. Your skin is your largest organ, your interface with the world. In winter, it becomes your most vulnerable frontier. Frostbite doesn't start at the core. It begins at the extremities, at the exposed surfaces, where cold can make direct contact. Fingers, toes, nose, ears, cheeks. These are where ice crystals first form in living tissue, where circulation first fails, where damage accumulates that might not be felt until it's far too late to prevent. The people of the plains, through hard experience, through losses that could never be fully recovered, learned how to protect this vulnerable frontier. Their methods were what we might call today low-tech, but they were based on solid understanding of what actually worked, what kept tissue alive when cold became truly life-threatening. Animal fat was the first defense, and calling it simple misses how sophisticated its use actually was. Not just any fat would do. Bear grease was prized above all, valued so highly it was traded extensively between groups that had access to it and those that didn't. Bear fat has properties that make it uniquely suited for skin protection. It's semi-solid at room temperature, but melts easily with body heat. It penetrates the outer layers of skin rather than just sitting on the surface. It provides waterproofing that sheds moisture while allowing skin to breathe. And it doesn't freeze solid until temperatures drop well below what kills unprotected humans. Buffalo tallow was more commonly available and almost as good. The fat rendered from buffalo, especially the thick deposits around organs and under the hide, could be processed into a substance that was easily applied and highly effective. Deer fat, elk fat, any animal fat really would be rendered and saved for this purpose. But bear grease remained the gold standard, the substance you used when conditions were most dire. Application was an art. You didn't just smear fat on randomly. Too much, and you'd waste a precious resource without additional benefit. Too little, and you'd leave gaps in protection. The fat would be warmed slightly, just enough to make it spreadable, but not hot enough to be uncomfortable. Then it would be rubbed into skin with firm massaging pressure. This massage wasn't incidental. It served multiple purposes. The mechanical action stimulated circulation, bringing blood flow to surface capillaries, increasing the skin's resistance to freezing. The warmth generated by friction helped the fat penetrate deeper into skin layers, and the rubbing distributed the fat evenly, creating a consistent protective layer. Areas that would be exposed received the most attention: face, particularly nose and cheeks, ears, backs of hands, if gloves would be removed for fine work. The fat created a barrier that was both physical and thermal. Physically, it blocked wind from making direct contact with skin, reducing convective heat loss. Thermally, it provided a tiny but meaningful layer of insulation, a buffer zone between body temperature and outside cold. But there was more to this technology than just fat alone. Ash from the fire would often be mixed with the fat, creating a paste that served additional functions. Ash particularly. Ash from certain woods contained compounds that affected the skin's surface chemistry in beneficial ways. The fine carbon particles in ash would increase the paste's opacity, helping to block what little ultraviolet radiation penetrated winter clouds, preventing something we'd call today snow blindness and reducing oxidative stress on skin cells. The alkalinity of ash would alter the pH of the fat mixture, potentially providing some antimicrobial properties, reducing the risk of skin infections that could become serious when treatment options were limited. The paste formed from fat, and ash had a texture that clung to skin more tenaciously than fat alone. It wouldn't wipe off easily, would survive sweat, and minor moisture exposure would remain effective through hours of exposure. And it had one more benefit that might seem minor, until you consider the psychological dimensions of winter survival. It created a visible layer, a mark that you had taken precautions, that you had armed yourself against the cold. You could see the protection, and seeing it provided confidence. Children would be treated with this paste each morning before any outdoor activity. Their skin was more vulnerable, their circulation less efficient, their ability to recognize dangerous cold exposure less developed. Parents would rub the protective mixture onto cheeks, noses, ears, anywhere that cold could bite. And the children would wear these marks like war paint badges that said they were prepared, that adults had taken care to armor them against danger. Adults would treat each other because reaching your own back, your own neck, was difficult. This mutual care, this physical assistance, reinforced bonds of community and responsibility. You protected others, and they protected you. Survival was never a solitary endeavor. On the longest winter journeys, when travel between camps was necessary, when exposure to brutal cold couldn't be avoided, additional measures would be taken. Extra layers of the paste would be applied. Wrappings of soft hide themselves, greased with fat, would be tied around vulnerable joints and extremities. The goal was to create a nearly sealed system where no skin made direct contact with outside air, where every surface was protected by multiple barriers. There were refinements and variations based on individual need and specific conditions. Those with particularly sensitive skin might have herbs mixed into the fat plants, chosen for properties that reduced inflammation or promoted healing. Some formulations included red ochre, iron-rich clay that added color and might have provided additional protective properties through unknown mechanisms that worked nonetheless. At night, the paste would be partially removed, wiped away with soft hide, or allowed to absorb while sleeping. Skin needs to breathe, needs time without barrier. But even overnight, a thin layer might be left, particularly in the coldest weather, particularly on the most vulnerable individuals. Morning would bring fresh application, careful inspection for any damage done by the previous day's exposure treatment of any areas showing early signs of frostbite. And frostbite was understood in its progression if not its microscopic mechanisms. They knew that reddened skin that went white was in danger. They knew that frozen tissue turned hard and grey. They knew that thawing frozen tissue too quickly was dangerous, could cause more damage than the freezing itself. Their treatment protocols, developed through experience, matched surprisingly well with modern medical advice. Gradual rewarming protection from refreezing, prevention of friction or pressure on affected areas. But prevention was always better than treatment, and the fat and ash barrier was primarily preventive. It was saying to the cold, you will not reach skin easily. You will have to work through this protective layer first. And in the time it takes you to do that, we will be moving, generating heat, returning to shelter. This skin will not freeze today. There was something else these barriers did that's harder to measure, but no less real. They created a psychological boundary between self and cold. The paste was armor, was shield, was conscious decision to resist rather than submit. Putting it on was ritual, was preparation, was acknowledgement that what lay ahead would be difficult, but that you were not defenseless. This mental dimension of protection mattered perhaps as much as the physical properties. In the deepest cold, when even these measures weren't quite enough, when exposure would be extreme, one more technique would be employed: heated stones. Small, smooth river rocks that could be held in the hand would be wrapped in hide and tucked into clothing. Against the body over major blood vessels, these stones would warm. The core would keep circulation flowing. Two extremities would extend the time that a person could survive exposure. The stones would cool eventually, but by then the person would be back at shelter, or the worst of the exposure would have passed. All of this, the fat, the ash, the paste and barriers and heated stones, all of it was knowledge purchased with frostbite and suffering with lost digits and damaged tissue, with lessons learned hard and taught insistently. Children were told stories, not gentle stories, but true ones about what happened when you went out unprepared, when you thought the cold wouldn't hurt you, when you failed to take precautions seriously. These weren't meant to traumatize, but to instill healthy respect, healthy fear of an enemy that killed without mercy if given opportunity. And yet, for all the danger, for all the harsh reality of winter survival, there was something almost beautiful in this knowledge. Humans, soft-skinned primates from tropical origins, had learned to live in conditions that should have killed them. They had observed, experimented, passed down understanding until they could do more than just survive. They could thrive, could maintain their culture, their dignity, their full humanity, even in the heart of winter that seemed designed to extinguish all warmth, all life. The fat and ash on their skin was last line of defense. Yes, but it was also declaration. We will not yield. We will protect ourselves. We will use what the earth provides to shield us from what the earth throws at us. And we will see spring again, our skin intact, our fingers and toes functional, our bodies whole and ready to face whatever comes next. But there was one more layer of protection we haven't discussed yet, one that operated outside the shelter entirely in the dangerous dark beyond the fire's reach. Because winter wasn't just cold. It was also a time when the boundary between safe camp and lethal wilderness became more dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. Night in a plains winter was not the gentle darkness we know now, softened by distant city lights, and the knowledge that help is only a phone call away. It was absolute primal, the kind of dark that feels like presence rather than absence. And in that darkness moved things that saw the tipi camps not as sanctuaries, but as opportunities, as gatherings of food rendered vulnerable by the very cold that made the camps necessary. Wolves, mountain lions, bears emerging from hibernation in confusion, even desperate coyotes grown bold by starvation. All of these understood that winter made prey weaker, slower, more desperate. And humans huddled in their shelters, surrounded by dogs and horses, and stored food, presented temptations that grew stronger as winter deepened and game grew scarce. The people who lived through these seasons understood that surviving winter meant more than just staying warm. It meant staying alive in every sense, defending against threats that the cold either created or exaggerated. And so, they developed systems of protection, layers of warning and defense that operated through the darkest nights, keeping watch when human eyes closed in exhausted sleep. Dogs were the first circle of protection, and their role went far beyond the body heat they provided inside the tipi. The dogs that earned their place in winter camps were working animals, creatures with breeding and training that made them partners in survival rather than just pets. These weren't modern companion dogs. They were larger, tougher animals bred from wolf-dog hybrids or descended from stock selected over countless generations for specific traits. They needed to be able to survive on limited food, to tolerate extreme cold, to work through discomfort without becoming ineffective. But most importantly, they needed to be alert, aggressive when necessary, and discriminating in their responses to threat. A good camp dog understood the difference between the ordinary sounds of winter and the subtle wrongness that meant danger. The crack of a branch breaking under weight in still cold air. The soft displacement of snow that meant something large was moving. The scent carried on wind of predator, different from prey, triggering different responses. These dogs were trained from puppyhood, exposed to situations and scents deliberately rewarded for correct responses and disciplined for incorrect ones. The training was sophisticated. Dogs learned different barks for different threats. A wolf approaching brought a specific pattern of sound, urgent but controlled, designed to wake humans without causing blind panic. A bear, rare but terrifying, brought a different sound, more frantic, because bears represented greater danger and needed faster response. Smaller predators like foxes or coyotes might be ignored or chased off by the dogs themselves without waking the camp at all. The dogs didn't sleep like humans. They drowsed, always partially alert, cycling through periods of rest that never became the deep unconsciousness that humans needed. Several dogs in a camp meant several sets of ears and noses, several alarm systems that monitored different directions, different threat vectors. They were positioned deliberately, tied, or allowed to roam in patterns that provided overlapping coverage. And they understood their role. This wasn't anthropomorphizing. These were animals whose survival was tied to the survival of the humans they lived with. A dog that failed to alert its pack to danger endangered itself. A dog that performed well was fed, valued, protected. The relationship was transactional in a sense, but it was also something deeper. These dogs were members of the community, had status and recognition, had names and histories. They weren't just tools, but partners, cooperative actors in the collective project of survival. Inside, the tipi weapons were positioned with care, not stored in some distant corner, but kept immediately accessible, ready to be grabbed in darkness without thought. Bows already strung, positioned where a practiced hand could find them instantly. arrows point sharp and ready. Spears or lances leaned against tipi poles at specific positions that everyone in the family knew. Knives on the body worn even when sleeping, or at least kept within immediate reach. This readiness wasn't paranoia, it was mathematics. A wolf can cover a surprising distance in the time it takes a sleeping human to wake, orient, and react. If weapons had to be assembled strung prepared, the opportunity for effective defense might be lost. But if you could wake with knife in hand, could reach out in practiced motion and grip your spear, could have an arrow knocked in the dark by feel alone, then you multiplied your chances of surviving an attack that might come without further warning than a dog's bark and the sound of something trying to tear through hide walls. The door of the tipi, that vulnerable opening, received special attention in winter. While it needed to remain functional for entry and exit, it would be reinforced. Additional hides might be hung to create a double door effect, an airlock that made forcing entry more difficult. The ties that secured the door covering would be positioned inside where they couldn't be manipulated from outside. And often a dog would sleep directly in front of the door, a living alarm that anything entering would have to pass. But defense wasn't just internal. The camp itself was chosen and arranged with protection in mind. We talked earlier about selecting locations for thermal advantages, but those same locations often provided defensive benefits. Campsites with approaches that could be monitored with natural barriers on one or more sides, with clear space around the tipi that made silent approach difficult, these were preferred. Trees or rocks that broke up the approach paths, that channeled potential threats into predictable routes, turned geography into ally. In some camps, particularly those meant to last through the entire winter, people would construct barriers from snow. Not walls exactly, but strategic piles of snow and ice that functioned as fences, creating boundaries that were visible even in darkness, that would make noise if disturbed, that turned the camp into something more like a fortress. Dogs would patrol the perimeter inside these boundaries, creating an early warning zone. The horses, kept close to camp in winter, were another part of the defense system. They would alert to predators sometimes, before the dogs their own fear-triggering responses that the dogs would hear and investigate. And horses themselves were potential prey-valuable resources that predators might target. Protecting the horses was protecting the means of travel, the ability to hunt effectively, the difference between mobility and being trapped afoot in hostile winter landscape. Stories were told around fires in the deepest winter of encounters with predators. These weren't just entertainment. They were education training for situations that might arise. Children learned from these stories what sounds to listen for how to react if they woke to find a predator near what the adults would do, and how children should support rather than hinder defense. The stories gave context to the weapons hanging ready to the dogs, sleeping alert to the constant low-level vigilance that characterized winter nights. And there were stories of failure too, of camps that were hit when people grew complacent, that let dogs become too comfortable and fat to be effective, that stored weapons where they couldn't be accessed quickly. These stories ended badly with losses that couldn't be recovered, with reminders that the price of inattention in winter could be absolute. These weren't told to frighten for its own sake, but to maintain the culture of preparedness, to ensure that knowledge of defense was never lost to a generation that thought itself safe. The psychology of sleeping in conditions where predators roamed in darkness shouldn't be underestimated. It created a particular kind of awareness, a resting state that wasn't quite full relaxation. Adults slept lightly, woke easily, maintained a kind of hair-trigger alertness, even in deepest sleep. This had costs-made rest, less restorative, added stress to already stressed systems. But it kept people alive. Children had to learn this too, had to be taught to wake silently when alerted, to move without panic, to follow instructions instantly, without question. A child's scream at the wrong moment, a sudden movement that spooked the adults into hasty action, these could turn manageable situations into disasters. So training began early drills that taught responses so deeply they became instinct. There were protocols for different scenarios. If dogs alerted to something distant, a single person might investigate, while others prepared, but didn't wake the whole camp unnecessarily. If the threat was immediate, everyone woke, everyone took position. The camp became a coordinated defensive unit in seconds. If an attack actually occurred, if something breached the perimeter and fighting became necessary, there were assigned roles movements that had been practiced, divisions of labor that maximized effectiveness while minimizing chaos. And afterward, if defense had been successful, if a predator had been driven off or killed, there would be inspection. The camp perimeter would be checked, trails examined to understand where the threat had come from and whether others might follow. The dogs would be reviewed, their performance judged, training adjusted if needed. The weapons would be cleaned, repaired if necessary, returned to their ready positions. And then people would try to return to sleep, though rest after adrenaline was never easy, especially when you knew the predator might circle and return. The guardianship of night was shared, was communal, was something that everyone contributed to according to their abilities. The dogs with their senses and their alert aggression, the adults with their weapons and their training and their willingness to fight for the family, the children with their learned discipline and their ability to stay calm in crisis, the horses with their nervousness that signaled danger. Even the landscape itself, chosen carefully, became part of the defensive system. And through it all, through the cold and the darkness and the very real danger, life continued. Families slept mostly peacefully, protected by layers of defense that made the night survivable. Children grew up learning that safety was something created, not assumed, that survival was active choice and constant readiness. Adults carried the weight of protection, but shared it, distributed it across the community, so no single person bore impossible burden. When morning came, when light revealed the landscape and made threats visible and less terrifying, there was a sense of having won another night, of having survived not just the cold, but everything that came with it. The day would bring its own challenges, but the night was conquered again, pushed back by vigilance and preparation, and the collective will to see another sunrise. And now we come to the end of our exploration, to the summing up of all these intricate, interlocking pieces of knowledge and technique. We've journeyed through the technologies of survival, from the grandest scale of landscape selection down to the intimate barrier of animal fat on skin, from the sophisticated engineering of shelter to the primal necessity of defense against predators. But there's one more thing to understand about all of this, one final piece that ties together everything we've learned. If you've been listening carefully, paying attention to all the details we've explored together, you might have noticed something remarkable. Each element we discussed, each technique and technology and piece of knowledge, none of them existed in isolation. They weren't separate survival tricks that someone could use independently. They were threads in a fabric, each one supporting and supported by the others, creating together something much stronger than any individual strand could be alone. This is what modern people often miss when we look back at indigenous technologies, at ways of life that seem primitive from our perspective of heated homes and insulated clothing and readily available food. We see individual techniques and judge them against modern equivalents. We say, oh, that's clever, or that's crude, or that wouldn't work as well as what we have now. But we miss the integration, the way everything fits together into a complete system that was optimized not for individual component performance, but for total systemic effectiveness. The choice of where to place the winter camp wasn't just about finding a warm spot. It was about being near water that wouldn't flood, but could be accessed, about having fuel sources that could be harvested safely, about having natural windbreaks that made the tipi design more effective, about selecting terrain that provided defensive advantages against predators. Every decision served multiple purposes, solved multiple problems simultaneously. The tipi wasn't just shelter. Its breathing hide covering worked with the liner system to manage moisture. Its smoke hole design cooperated with the fire placement to create effective ventilation. Its shape shed snow that would have buried a flat-roofed structure. Its size was calculated to balance the space needed for living against the challenge of heating that space. Its orientation considered sun, wind, and social organization. It was a node in the network of survival, not a standalone solution. The fire wasn't just for warmth. It cooked food that provided calories that generated body heat. It heated stones that extended warmth into sleeping areas. It dried wood that would fuel tomorrow's fire. It provided light that extended useful time into the dark hours. It was a social center that maintained psychological cohesion through the long isolation of winter. And its careful management conserved fuel that had been gathered from locations chosen partially because they provided fuel. The bedding wasn't just for comfort. It insulated sleepers from ground that would have stolen their heat. It used materials that were available because of the camp location. It positioned people in arrangements that optimized shared body heat. It was maintained by labor that also maintained social bonds through the act of communal care. And it allowed sleep that was restorative enough that people could perform the physical labor that the rest of the system required. The fat and ash barrier wasn't just skin protection. It was preparation ritual that reinforced readiness before exposure. It was communal care that strengthened bonds. It used resources that were available because of successful hunting that was possible because of the overall effectiveness of the winter survival system. And it protected skin that allowed the physical work that maintaining the system demanded. The dogs weren't just alarms. They were heat sources. They were companions that eased psychological stress. They were hunting aids that helped provide food. They were training opportunities that taught children about responsibility and consequence. And their protection allowed the sleep that humans needed to maintain all the other elements of survival. Every piece reinforced every other piece. A failure in one area could cascade through the system. If camp location was chosen poorly, fuel might be scarce, making fire management difficult, making warmth harder to maintain, making sleep less restful, making people less capable of the work needed to maintain defenses, to prepare bedding, to apply protective barriers. If dogs weren't trained properly, predator defense would fail, sleep would be disrupted, stress would increase, effectiveness would decline across all domains. But when everything worked together, when the full system was operational and maintained, the result was something that seems almost miraculous, given the harshness of the conditions. Families lived through winters that should have killed them. They didn't just survive in misery, but maintained quality of life, maintained their culture, their ceremonies, their stories, their humanity. Children were born and raised healthy. Elders lived to pass on knowledge. The community persisted. This integration, this systemic thinking, was the real genius that we often overlook. Any individual technique could be studied, reproduced, perhaps even improved by modern methods. But the way everything fit together, the way each element was designed, not for independent excellence, but for compatibility and mutual support, that's harder to recreate. That's knowledge that emerges from generations of lived experience, from countless small adjustments and refinements from a relationship with environment that was intimate and continuous. We live in a different world now. We've traded systemic integration for modular solutions, specialized answers to individual problems. Our heating is independent of our architecture. Our clothing is divorced from our food sources. Our defenses against danger are abstract, handled by distant institutions rather than personal preparedness. There are advantages to this, certainly. But there are also losses, things we've forgotten, capabilities we no longer maintain. When you picture those winter camps now in your mind, I hope you see them differently than when we started this journey. Not as primitive holdouts against civilization, but as sophisticated implementations of systemic knowledge. Not as people barely surviving, but as communities that had solved the problem of winter so thoroughly that they could do more than just endure it. They could live fully within it. The cold outside the tipi was absolute. The wind was merciless. The dark was complete. But inside, protected by layers of knowledge and technique, by shelter and fire and bedding, and barrier by dogs and weapons, and watchfulness by cooperation, and shared warmth and communal care, life continued. Not in deprivation, but in a richness that we've perhaps lost, a completeness that came from understanding that survival wasn't about dominating nature, but about finding your place within natural patterns, about arranging yourself so carefully that the cold simply had fewer ways to reach you. As the snow falls outside that imagined camp, as the wind finds and tests the tipi without finding purchase, as the family sleeps warm in their carefully prepared nests, while dogs keep watch and weapons wait ready. There's a lesson here that transcends survival technique. It's about integration, about thinking in systems, about understanding that solutions to complex challenges rarely come from single brilliant innovations, but from patient assembly of many good solutions into coherent wholes. The people who wintered on the plains, who developed and refined and passed down all this knowledge we've explored tonight, they weren't smarter than us. They weren't superhuman. They were simply people who paid attention, who learned from failure, who valued the wisdom of elders, who taught their children carefully, who understood that the price of forgotten knowledge was death. And in that understanding, in that attention and care and teaching, they created something that lasted for centuries, that allowed human life to flourish in conditions that seem impossible to us now, in our comfortable, climate-controlled world. So as we close this journey, as you prepare to drift into whatever sleep waits for you tonight, perhaps think about the systems in your own life, about how things connect, about how solutions in one area affect challenges in another, about the value of integration of thinking, not in terms of individual problems and solutions, but in terms of complex systems that need balanced attention. And perhaps, just perhaps, feel a moment of gratitude for the warmth that surrounds you, the shelter that requires so little of you to maintain the abundance that makes survival so much less immediate a concern. But also, feel a moment of wonder for those who survived without these advantages, who created life and culture and meaning in conditions that would kill us in hours. They were your ancestors, all of our ancestors, in a sense, the ones who learned these lessons and passed them forward until we could build the world we live in now. The wind outside their camp has finally died down. The storm is passing. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new work, new necessities. But tonight, the fire burns low and warm, the family sleeps peacefully, and winter, for all its power, has been held at bay by nothing more than knowledge, preparation, and the human capacity to learn and adapt and survive together. Sleep well. Dream of warmth in the heart of winter, and remember that comfort is something we create, not something we're given a lesson that will always remain true, no matter how much our technology advances, no matter how far we seem to have come from those winter camps on the endless plains. Thank you for traveling with me tonight. I'm Peter Miller, and I'm honored you chose to spend these hours exploring this remarkable chapter of human resilience. Until we meet again, stay warm, stay curious, and remember that every comfort you enjoy exists because someone somewhere sometime learned how to survive without it. That knowledge, that accumulated wisdom of survival, is part of what makes us human. And it's worth remembering, worth honoring, worth carrying forward into whatever winters still wait ahead.